What is up, folks? Casual Dad here with another faction breakdown. After my Servants of the Emperor, and I don't remember which one. No, that was the last one. I had a request to go ahead and do Orks next, so we'll go ahead and dive right in. From a meta standpoint, Orks are one of the most powerful factions in the game. With Badruk, Snickrot, I think those are the top dogs right now. Those are the ones you'll see the most often. They're really, really good. You'll also see Zagstruck, you'll see Gazgul. You'll see pretty much all of these played. The one you're going to see least often is Wartsnaga. We'll talk a little bit about why in a second. But they are just an incredibly strong faction. They've got a ton of variety, a lot of options, and some really, really powerful cards. Popular to play, fun to play, a absolutely terrific faction. So we'll jump right into it. So first off, the cheapest at 23. You can already see they start at a higher price point. Wartsnaga is definitely a cheaper warlord, but he's still more expensive than most equivalents in other factions' cheapest. But, like I say, in all these faction breakdowns, it's really good to keep in mind that the cheapest warlord has a base advantage, just that you can really cram bodyguards in there because you have the extra points. Stats are not great, but that's where we get straight into his ability. So he is epic. He does get rank 4 Inspiring Presence at max, so he does the damage buff to himself and then all allies on the board. And then also he has Outflank. So he does you steal your opponent's bonus and get that bonus for yourself. So pretty good. Being epic, he does level slowly. And then also having that Outflank max at rank 2 means it's a bonus, but it's not going to make much difference. The real money with this guy is that ability right here. So if you have an Orc card that costs 10 or less and it dies, all other friendly Orc cards, including ones that haven't been played yet, gain 10% of their attack stats. So right off the bat, that influences your deck building. You're going to want probably a full 5 bodies that are under 10 points. Now, personally, I tend to load that up with endless cards. So I take your little Smirkit, and then I think this guy's endless. Okay. So these two right here, that's 4 copies right there. They'll almost trigger it, and then you throw in one other. Pretty typical to see your Baza over here. Or I'm a big fan of Makari. Makari dies a little bit more slowly, so he doesn't give the bonus right away, but he's just the greatest grot. So those are the cards you want to do in there, and then you fill your deck with cards that are very, very powerful, who already have really good stats, so that they will get the most bonus from a percent increase, but also can carry the rest of the game. And I've also found that you want to keep Wartsnaga decks relatively small, because you want to make sure that you can control when you play your cheap cards, get them killed early so you get the stat bonus early, so that your powerful cards can have the impact when they come into play. So you do end up with a smaller deck, and so obvious choices are going to be things that have Barrage. So your Barrage cards that can really make the most of those stat bonuses. This guy, and so one of those stats as well, I believe it's also hit points to their attack stats. No, okay, so it's just their attack stats. So you do want things that already have high offensive output already. So at 76, we'll very quickly ramp up, getting up to, what is that, a 50% increase if you get all 5 stacks. So, and if you get this guy a little leveled up, if you have Inspire from Makari, really, really makes a difference. Of course, the Mangler, utterly terrifying if you had 50% increased stats to this thing. But for me personally, I end up, because of the balance where Wartsnaga doesn't have very impressive stats, even after the bonus, doesn't increase his hit points. He's a warlord you don't ever want to play. So you want to make sure that whatever cards you have to fill out your deck are tough enough that they can keep him alive. So you can sprinkle in your Taunt. So this guy, of course, technically you can still have it in your deck even if you have Makari, which is silly, but you know. This guy has that Taunt, extremely durable card. If you have the red Gobbo, the endless Taunt card, that can really make a big difference. Throw in some Medicae, ideally some cheaper ones, but I end up, right now, my deck includes a lot of shields. So, of course, my kind of key card is this guy, both because I have a decently leveled one that I wanted to use, and Wartsnaga is one of the few decks where it makes sense to use it. Because at this level, he's pretty scary, but his stats aren't that great, but you tack on that 3 shields and then also the 50% damage increase and that giant stack of hit points. He's not bad. I can't say it's one of my better performing decks, but that's sort of where I've gotten at this point. Some other obvious choices are going to be your big, beefy, and rage cards, or Berserk, excuse me. And then some of your faster, harder hitting ones. Like this guy will ramp up real fast and has that attack on the drop. So if you lose all of your cheap cards early on, this guy comes in extremely aggressive. So he's a good one to include. And that is something to keep in mind, is your attack on drop cards can hit just that much harder once you get that bonus up. Just zooming right along, that was Wartsnaga. Next up is Zagstruck. His stats are actually pretty similar. He ends up with hit points actually lower than Wartsnaga, with a higher melee attack, does not get the buff and doesn't have the Inspire. He's another one that you hope not to play, but his ability is, whenever a friendly card would ready, instead it makes an attack for 100% of its melee stat. So if this guy hits the table at max level, he's hitting for 86 damage, just boom. Whatever's in front of him or whatever taunt card is there just takes that hit right away. So it's a very, very powerful ability, especially if you take into account cards that have ready, like this guy's a standard one. You play this, and then once deployment is finished, it will just hit the opposing card for 43 damage. If you have Inspire on the table, it will hit harder. And then cards like my personal favorite for Zagstruck, this guy, has the attack on drop already from that Furious Charge, and then will attack again because it has that ready itself. And then if it's your turn, he can attack a third time. So when you drop this guy in a Zagstruck deck, he can hit 3 times before the enemy even has a chance to hit him back. So it is utterly devastating. A very common move is to take a pretty heavy ready melee deck. You see a lot of cards like... You see this guy in there pretty often. You see this guy. Cards that already have an attack on drop that you can give an additional attack on drop and that have a high melee attack. Another typical thing to do is to also include your Psychers. Of course, this guy here. Because most Orc cards have both a ranged and a melee attack. And so they're only going to ready or activate if you do a Psychic attack. And this guy already has a high Psychic value. So he's really good at clearing shields and doing some disruption value and helping against Akaran. But if you're doing Psychic every time, your cards are all attacking, and any non-Psyker across the board will not hit you back. Which brings up the obvious weakness of Zagstruck. He doesn't love shields. He's an extremely aggressive deck that will just power through things. It can manage shields, but that is actually why you bring that Psyker, is to wipe those shields. You can also throw this guy in here for that area effect damage, because if you play him at a key time, he also can be used to wipe some shields and take out some injured cards, especially now that he also has Furious Charge if you level him up a bit. But the biggest thing that Zagstruck doesn't like is heavy Psychic decks, because in a case like that, you have to fall back on just using a melee attack, and so you lose the advantage of hitting without being hit back. So if you end up against an Ahriman deck, it can be a little rough. But he tends to do okay in just melee, so you can usually hang in those matches. It's not that bad. But those are the bad matchups for him, is if you end up having to do Psychic attacks, you'll take a lot more damage back, or if you have to do melee because there's a scary Psyker on the board. So just watch out for that. Zagstruck is great in campaigns, especially campaigns against a faction that doesn't have Psychers. You go up against Tau, and Zagstruck has a field day. Necrons as well, but they tend to be a little bit more durable, so they're less glassy and can take the hits a little bit better. But there is your Zagstruck. He's one of the better Warlords. He's one that when I started out I used heavily. He was my best Orc Warlord for a long time. Pretty solid, and I still see him. If you watched my ranked breakdown the other day, you would see, I did a video of going from top 10% to top 6%. There was a Zagstruck deck that was like 3.6k that wasn't very well leveled, that just shows how effective you can be with him even at lower levels, because he has such an advantage against AI play. So, absolutely terrific. Next up, you've got Snickerat, who is very popular. His stats are actually pretty good, especially because he has Fear. Max level Fear, even if he only has the melee attack stat, his hit points are only a little bit higher than the last two, and so is his cost. But that Fear really makes up the difference and makes him a little bit more durable. He can be a melee finisher, it's just like Zagstruck, but a little bit more durable. But he's still one where you want to finish the game before he lands on the table. He can hang a little bit, but not a ton. You want to be careful with him. But his ability is this magnificent monstrosity. When one of your Orc cards attacks a card that is not opposite them, the attack deals an additional 100% damage. So that is double damage for Barrage. The cards aside from the main target will take it. The area effect Psychic, that Psionic Blast, will do double damage to anything off the main target. And then if you have an open lane for any reason, then the card shooting will deal double damage. So if you are up against an enemy Warlord and you have a card with nothing opposite it, you will quickly mop up that Warlord, unless it's one of the really scary beefy ones. So extremely powerful, obviously makes really strong use of target acquired. so that you can force your cards to attack off lane or diagonally. So you can quickly do insane amounts of damage with those. So you see a lot of that. So just to recap, so you end up with your target acquired cards. Where are you, buddy? This one? No, the other one. I always mix those two up. Where's he? Well, of course, there's my personal favorite is Spookums, and then of course the 6-point. And then there's another one in here. Where are you? The pirate hat. There you are, that one. This guy. So those are your 3 target acquireds. Again, they will let you get the most out of Zagstrek's ability. Excuse me, Snickrot's ability. But then a couple other tactics. Of course, there's the Psyker I mentioned. This guy does just insane damage if they aren't able to deal with him quickly. Doing that double damage and that area effect attack. Really, really good to have in there. And he can also really help out because start of your turn, his area effect will finish off injured cards and open up lanes for your other cards to get double damage attacks. So kind of an auto-include that one. I always include him in those decks. Another strategy is to have a really, really hard attack on drop. So like your Skardaka, you can drop him to take out a card that has 80 or so, like a reasonable amount of hit points left, but clear that so that then his shot in the follow-up, and you want to do that in your turn, so that the follow-up shot will be double damage. And then, of course, the standouts of the Squig Buggy and the Mad Mangler and the new Gork's Foot are all really, really good in Snickrot decks. Not a lot more to say about that. It does take careful play, and there are some counters. Obviously, someone like Akaran can really stand up to it because you want those cleared lanes, which is just that little extra step harder if they have that extra life. Also doesn't love shields, but usually has enough devastating firing output, and you can choose to target other things around them, and usually has Barrage or that Psionic Blast. You can usually do okay against both of those. Some of the worst matchups, you end up being pretty heavily shooting or ranged. So if you go up against a Tau deck or another deck that can shoot back harder, Tolmaron and any of the Tau Warlords can be tough matchups, and some of the Necron shooting ones too. So you want to watch out for that, but most matchups are going to be good, especially if you can snag those double damage hits to really clear through an enemy deck fast. Hilariously, Snickrot loves Taunt, because Taunt cuts incoming damage by like a third, and he doubles it, so he's still doing a bonus 70% damage against Taunt cards. So if you're having a lot of trouble with Taunt, Snickrot's your guy. Next up, we get to my personal gaming nemesis, Badruk. I got beef with Badruk, but in terms of talking about him as a Warlord, he's extremely good, very focused on range shooting. He's actually one of the tougher Warlords. He's up there, of course, with the next two are going to be even tougher. But good shooting. Just recently, he always had that precision shot, but just recently got that ready. So he comes up with, when he deploys in the following shooting phase, his cards will have a bonus ranged attack, which is terrifying considering the decks he ends up in. And his ability is Darippa. When one of your Orc cards destroys an enemy card with a ranged attack, that Orc card attacks for 60% of its ranged attack. Couple key things about this. Number one, timing. This is when you attack, so it happens before other abilities trigger. So if you're up against the Magus or Rakarth, where their cards get a health bonus when friendly cards are killed, you will get all of your shots with Badruk first, which also applies if you're playing against Badruk. If you're expecting your bonus health ability to save you from shots, it won't. He gets every single advantage where there is no limit to the number of attacks, and they all will complete before any of those abilities trigger. So Canoness, those melee attacks back when a friendly card dies, happen after Badruk shoots, so you could lose cards that would have gotten free melee attacks. You should have a card that attacks like 6 times, instead it doesn't attack at all because it gets wiped out. A couple other things about that too, that also includes barrage shots. So if you've got a card with 400 health, but it's next to a card with like 6 health, and somebody like this guy, I have seen this thing shoot 6 times. You'll have your 300 health card right in the middle. This shoots a barrage, overflow damage takes out one of your wounded bodyguards. Hopefully it's not endless. And then he shoots again. That second barrage shot takes out another bodyguard. He shoots again, and then he kills the main target, and then he shoots again. Like, this thing can shoot so many times. And the combination of barrage and that repeated shot makes it completely nuts. There are entire deck types that are utterly invalidated because of Badruk, because they make endless and cheaper squishy cards a huge liability. So like Wartsnaga, who deliberately includes cards that want to die, If you start with all of your cheap cards in the deck, it's good. But if for any reason Badruk shows up and you have cheap cards on the table later, he can really punish that. Extremely powerful Warlord. He ends up performing well in the top tables. You're going to see scary Badruk decks from all the way at the very bottom of the ladder all the way to the top. Yeah, extremely powerful. I got beef. But you can't say he's not a very powerful Warlord. Things he doesn't like shields. He doesn't like really high hit point or healing opponents, so most decks end up fairly durable so that they can tank Badruk hits. You want to be very careful with positioning. You want to make sure that you don't have, just like the scenario I was describing, you want to make sure that your taunts are played carefully, that your high health cards are played carefully, so you're not triggering board wipes by accident. You got to watch out for that. And one of the other things to know is that you will almost certainly run into one of these. You'll almost certainly run into one of these. These are very common in Badruk decks, and then you will probably see one of these. And the AI that you play against, if you're playing against a Badruk deck, will almost always play this late. It drops on the field doing, usually they're, more in this range. So it drops for the better part of 100 damage, which can also trigger the bonus shot as it deploys. So you could have your board wiped before Badruk even takes his turn. And likewise on Badruk himself, he also has that attack on drop. So he is scary. And he's been nerfed multiple times and then nerfed up and down. The most recent changes he got that ready. I expected him to kind of not appear in the ladder as successfully after the latest secondary traits add, because that ready's not one of the more powerful traits. But it edges up his damage just enough that once he hits the table, I lose to him more often than I used to, which was surprising. But yeah, really, really scary. Yeah, and several of the best Orc cards that I've mentioned multiple times are heavy ranged cards, so he plays perfectly into the strengths of the faction. So watch out for that guy, play as that guy. I will make it my mission to beat your deck if you run as him, but can't say he's not good. Next up, we'll go on to Ghazghkull, who was one of my first champions. This is a guy I got early in the game, and he's a really good Headhunter Warlord. Because he's got the really high hit points himself, he hits incredibly hard. He just got the secondary trait of that Inspiring Presence, and with his base damage, the Inspiring Presence bonus is significant. But also he already had Furious Charge, so when he plays he attacks, and then his ability is whenever any one of your Orc cards kills an enemy card with any type of attack, he immediately gains plus 10 melee attack. So if you're up against a larger deck, that can stack up to be pretty ridiculous. And then at max level, this guy's just a complete beatstick. And I called him a Headhunter Warlord. The reason I said that is his role is to get on the board and kill the enemy Warlord, and go toe-to-toe with the enemy Warlord and beat it in a 1-to-1 fight. And there are very few Warlords that can take a fight with Ghazghkull, especially after he's built up that attack to be like 200, which is not at all unusual if you get a bunch of kills. It's very common to see Ghazghkull decks right now use a lot of shooting, to use a bunch of really heavy shooting ranged cards to get kills to charge up his ability, and then also give him a slowly building melee attack buff so that when he drops he can do like 500 damage. Which is great because that's the kind of damage that will punch through Akaran's shields, it'll punch through Swarmlord, it'll punch through a Avatar. He's one of the bigger, brawnier, fightier Warlords. So if you want a Warlord that's not going to get picked off quickly when he hits the table, Ghazghkull is your guy. He's great. Extremely aggressive. Does really, really well in the current meta because he can actually hang against some of the punchier Warlords like... Santa. I always forget his name. Logan, Grimnar. He can stand up against the Space Wolves Warlord in a fight. He can deal with the Avatar. He can tank some of the heavier hits. I usually classify him as a bruiser. He is a Headhunter because his role is to kill the enemy Warlord, but he's a bruiser because he's one of the Warlords like Abaddon, who can also take out a couple bodyguards on the way and still finish off a fight one-on-one with an enemy Warlord. You can really build any deck you want around him. I tend to prefer them being a little bit durable. And it's actually a lot of fun. You can do thematic decks around him, so you could look for Goth cards. So the keyword Goth doesn't do anything, but they're thematic and it kind of makes sense. So I like to include Black Death, and I like to include, of course, Makari, who is Ghazghkull's buddy. So, yeah, really good one. Fairly standard. He's the only one whose ability does not trigger until he hits the board. Every single other one has an ability that triggers even while they're in your deck. But his ability is very potent and feeds into what he does as a warlord and what his decks do as a deck. He's one of the more expensive ones, so you do need to be aware of that building around him. You will run out of points quickly. Last but not least, I personally think that Mozrog Scragbad is the best, most competitive warlord in the Orc faction. And he plays differently than the others because he really, really rewards bringing a very small deck of just the toughest possible monstrosities out there. Downside, he is epic. Most of the cards that he uses in the deck are also epic, so the entire deck levels extremely slowly. But if you ever see a high-level Mozrog deck in play, you will see what I mean. So his stats are no joke. By far, he's only a little bit more expensive than Gaz, but starts with a giant chunk of health. Decent attack stats, but that's made up for by his Berserk, so he builds up attacks throughout. And also he has Furious Charge. But the real terrifying magic of Mozrog is his ability. Every single time one of your orcs makes a melee attack, it gains 10% of its health. So these things are just healing. So the combination of really high hit points, so he gets 40 plus health back every time he attacks. He attacks on the drop, so he immediately gets plus 40 health for just hitting the board. And then also that Berserk, so he can build up his attack stats as he goes through, makes him just really unpleasant to deal with. And the most common decks you see with him are usually you got Medicae, you got Taunt, some target acquired, but you'll see things like this guy, who also attacks on the drop, has a ton of hit points and also has really high attack stats, and also has Berserk. When you get to Berserk rank 4 with this thing, it's just wailing away on the enemy decks, and it just takes so much to remove and does so much damage back. It's very typical to see just this guy, and then maybe this guy. All cards that have very high hit points, good base melee, also can hang in shooting, but just soak insane amounts of damage as they're healing. And then it's pretty common to also see a Medicae. I personally enjoy Grotznik, because he also has good health and a good melee attack himself, so he's not just Medicae, he also can contribute. But it's more common to see one of the cheaper ones and let the other guys do the heavy lifting. So, yeah. Again, if you see a high-level Mozrog, it's just an unbelievable amount of health to punch through. And if you're talking about like a Badrek or an Akaran, Akaran decks don't really do that much damage, all told. So if they're up against just a wall of flesh that's healing constantly and punching incredibly hard, they will fold. And that's true of most decks. And then especially the aggressive punchy decks that try to break down and get to the Warlord quickly, you get to Mozrog and you're like, okay, great, now what? I don't see him all that much in the competitive ladder, but when I do, I know it's going to be a tough matchup. And I personally run him quite a bit, and he was a rock star of my ladder season last time. And if we actually look here at my deck, we can kind of talk about what I put in there. And I can actually look at the decks real quick before we wrap up here. I've already talked about kind of the key bodyguards, so I don't really want to focus on the individual cards in the faction. We've already talked about that. This is a pretty typical Mozrog deck. You throw in your Taunt in there just to keep your guys alive. Because Mozrog has the heal, you throw in a Taunt at a key time, and your cards can heal back up to reasonable health. Usually over the course of the game, they're taking a bit of a beating, and so you don't want to lose them. Like, if you lose this thing, then that's a much more uphill battle. If that's your kind of key piece that's been building up damage and it gets pretty low, say someone nails it with a target acquired, especially a Snickrot, if it gets close to death, you drop your Taunt, and then you get a couple free turns of melee attacks where it can heal back up to be durable again, and you can deal with some of those threats. So that's how I like to run it. Again, I've got Grotznik in here. I could shuffle this around to have a cheaper Medicae and throw in some more expensive, like another more expensive melee hitter. But as you probably saw, the key piece that I want to include, this guy, mine's really low level, level 2. So not one I'm going to put in yet, but as he gets to, upper levels, this is the guy you're going to see most, and that is the guy you want to watch out for. So that is Mozrog. Let's look at some of the other ones real quick. Some of the more effective decks I've been running. My favorite Warlord is, of course, Mozrog in the Orks. Second is going to be Gaz. We'll see if this... Yeah, there we go. Again, I like the Goffs. I like the area effect to kind of clear out shields and prepare the way for Gaz himself to pop on the board. Another reason I like Gaz personally is he's one of the first Warlords I had, so he's pretty high leveled. I'm real close to getting that final hit, which is going to be a big level up. But yeah, love this guy. The Warbiker War Boss is incredible. This guy's a pretty solid, just beefy piece. Still not maybe my most competitive deck, but it does the trick, especially with the sheer volume of damage that Ghazghkull can unleash. And then, of course, next up is going to be ours. Well, we can look. Oh, jeez. I'm not going to show my Badruk. You're going to see Badruk decks. Mine is a weird, cheesy one. Oh, actually, let's see. What is it? Oh, another thing you'll note about Badruk is his cards have very high hit points, so they are hard to deal with while they're just wailing on you. Yeah, that's pretty standard. And then also, they are all very fast. So usually Badruk is going to go first against just about any deck, so that's another advantage. Very scary. But yeah, that's fairly standard. My plane isn't terribly high level, so that's not as scary as you're going to see in some other games. We're going to go ahead and look at Snickrot. Let's see what mine is. Probably a weird one. Yeah, got the taunt in there. I've got the 2 target acquired and then the 2 heavy ranged hitters. This one's okay. Again, I'm missing some of the levels, and my Snickrot could probably be better. I don't have the Psyker in here, which is a bummer. But that's what I've run before. I don't play him much. I just know that he's really, really scary, especially in the current campaign. And then in the competitive ladder, you can see some truly terrifying Snickrots. And then, of course, Zagstruck. Fairly standard here, and Zagstruck is one I do play more, and so these cards are fairly high leveled. A lot of these just rely on attacking multiple times and hitting really, really, really hard to try to just pound down the enemy deck before it really gets rolling. And then I do want to make sure to show off my Wartsnaga, just to show what I talked about there, and let's see if this is still what I thought it was. Yeah, okay. So I've got my 2 Endless, so you have total control of when you play what with the smaller deck, so that's why you include that. So this is how I've built this up, pretty much what I said. 2 shielded cards to kind of deal with some offense to protect Wartsnaga himself, because the biggest weakness of that deck, and still the thing that makes it not as competitive as the others, is Wartsnaga himself. He is very, very fragile, and if he hits the deck, hits the board, there's a good chance you're going to lose that game. So, got to watch out for that one. I know there are some really effective decks with him, but this is the best one I've worked out so far. Alright, that is your Orks faction breakdown. I hope that was helpful, and of course, holler if you want to see another one out there. Until next time.